March 21, 1980. South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Rain-slicked streets reflected the neon glow of shuttered bars. A black Cadillac coasted to a stop outside a low-rise apartment. Inside, Tommy DiCarlo, a mid-level enforcer for the Bruno family, sipped bourbon. He thought he was untouchable, trusted by Angelo Bruno himself. Then the phone rang. A voice, cold and unfamiliar, gave a single order. Tommy's eyes widened. He had done everything for the family. Everything. Yet in that moment, he understood. Loyalty had a price. Within hours, he vanished. No gunshots, no struggle. Just silence. The reason? Not a failed hit, not betrayal in the streets. Bruno feared Tommy's influence. His organizational skill had become a threat. A man who could control crews, coordinate operations, and hold the loyalty of soldiers could also replace a boss. And in the Mafia, power alone is enough to kill. Thomas DiCarlo was born on July 12, 1947, in South Philadelphia, a neighborhood stitched together with brick row houses, corner markets, and the hum of Italian-American families clinging to tradition. His father, Salvatore DiCarlo, was a butcher with ties to local unions, a man respected and feared in equal measure. From a young age, Tommy absorbed the unspoken lessons of power, how to command attention without raising his voice, how to read loyalty like a ledger, and how subtle intimidation often achieved more than brute force. School offered little escape. The city was divided, ethnic enclaves, gang rivalries, and the looming shadow of organized crime. Tommy was clever, observant, a natural negotiator. By age 14, he was running errands for neighborhood figures, small loans, minor collections. These tasks, trivial to some, were formative. They taught him hierarchy, patience, and discretion. He understood early that the Mafia was not merely about violence, it was about control, optics, and timing. By the early 1960s, Tommy had begun working for small crews under the eyes of established family soldiers. Unlike many of his peers, he did not relish notoriety. He preferred efficiency. Crew members gravitated toward him not because he demanded respect, but because he organized operations that rewarded everyone. He learned bookkeeping, territory mapping, and the subtle art of mediation between rival factions. Yet beneath the composed exterior, a quiet ruthlessness was taking shape. He was fiercely loyal to those above him, but he also cataloged weaknesses, noticed fissures in the chain of command, and imagined how influence could shift. Friends recall evenings spent in smoky bars, Tommy sketching layouts of businesses, routes, and potential operations. He spoke of expansion, strategy, and the limits of fear.
Family members remember him differently. The boy who would bring home pastries, who laughed easily, who hid the intensity of his mind behind a genial smile. Those dualities, affectionate son, calculating enforcer, would define his trajectory. And as he moved closer to the inner circle of Angelo Bruno, it became clear. A man who could manage men, balance egos, and enforce obedience without visible threat was no longer just a soldier. He was a rising instrument of power. And in the Mafia, that is exactly when danger begins. By the late 1960s, Tommy DiCarlo had cemented his reputation as a meticulous operator. Unlike street-level enforcers who relied on brute force, Tommy excelled at orchestration. He managed crews, allocated territories, and oversaw operations that spanned loan sharking, gambling, and protection rackets. His name was whispered in bars and back offices alike, not with fear, but with respect. His ascent coincided with the quiet consolidation of power under Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don. Bruno's leadership style was calculated, subtle, patient, and politically adept. Violence was used sparingly, diplomacy strategically. Tommy fit seamlessly into this paradigm. He was a man who could implement Bruno's orders efficiently and at the same time anticipate obstacles before they materialized. Tommy's crews became the backbone of South Philadelphia's organized crime landscape. He coordinated shipments of illicit goods, ensured smooth operation of illegal clubs, and managed the flow of cash to the family's top brass. He earned the trust of soldiers and associates alike, bridging the gap between street-level operators and the inner circle. But what set Tommy apart was not only his efficiency, it was his visibility. He was everywhere, yet nowhere conspicuous. At union halls, he negotiated quietly. In gambling dens, he mediated disputes before they escalated. At docks and warehouses, he supervised logistics with precise timing. His influence was growing, silently, structurally, like roots expanding underground. Colleagues noted his calm under pressure. When a shipment went missing or a loan was contested, Tommy's response was measured: assess, negotiate, enforce if necessary. No panic, no public spectacle. It was this reliability that caught Bruno's attention, and soon Tommy was entrusted with sensitive operations that required discretion and foresight. Yet as his power grew, so too did the whispers. Soldiers spoke of his uncanny ability to organize crews with a loyalty that sometimes rivaled the boss himself. Associates began to look to him for direction, to defer decisions to his judgment. For a man who had risen quietly, it was a dangerous visibility. In the shadows of loyalty, ambition was becoming detectable. By the mid-1970s, Tommy DiCarlo was no longer just a competent enforcer. He was an indispensable architect of the Bruno family's operations. And in the Mafia, indispensability is a double-edged sword. The higher you rise, the more eyes study your every move. And those eyes often belong to the man at the top, the one who defines who survives and who disappears.
It was the spring of 1976 when the first cracks appeared. Tommy DiCarlo had just orchestrated a high-stakes gambling takeover in South Philadelphia, consolidating multiple crews under his coordination. The operation was flawless. Profits surged. Soldiers spoke of him with admiration and unease. Angelo Bruno noticed. The Don's style was subtle. He rarely punished success, but he measured influence carefully. He understood the quiet power of a man who could command loyalty without wielding a gun in the open, and Tommy was doing just that. The first warning came in whispers. Bruno's capos began questioning Tommy's decisions, small, seemingly trivial disagreements, but each laced with undertones of control. Tommy, ever precise, dismissed them outwardly, but inwardly he recognized the pattern. Influence was dangerous, especially when it was visible. The turning point came during a meeting with Philadelphia union leaders. Tommy had negotiated a lucrative arrangement that funneled significant cash into the family's coffers, bypassing middlemen. Soldiers cheered, but the inner circle, Bruno's confidants, took note. Tommy had demonstrated that he could operate independently, enforce loyalty, and secure wealth with minimal supervision. Bruno's paranoia, normally dormant, was quietly awakened. A man who could manage crews, appease soldiers, and negotiate with unions without oversight was no longer just an asset, he was a potential rival. To the boss, Tommy's brilliance had become dangerous. Simultaneously, external pressures mounted. Federal investigations into organized crime in Philadelphia were intensifying. Politicians, law enforcement, and newspapers were probing the family's operations. Tommy's role made him a focal point. His efficiency drew attention, and attention is lethal in the Mafia. By 1978, subtle signals became overt. Orders that once flowed smoothly through Tommy were rerouted. Allies hesitated. Meetings were shifted. The men who had once deferred to his judgment now glanced over their shoulders. Tommy understood the calculus. In the Mafia, rising too high too fast under a boss like Bruno carries consequences that no skill, loyalty, or caution can fully mitigate. The very abilities that elevated him, the precision, the influence, the strategic mind, had marked him for elimination. In the Mafia, brilliance is rarely tolerated. Ambition must be invisible. And Tommy DiCarlo, a man who had mastered the art of control, had inadvertently crossed the invisible line. By 1978, Tommy DiCarlo's influence had extended far beyond the streets of South Philadelphia. His crews controlled gambling dens, loan operations, and protection rackets. But more importantly, he had forged connections with local politicians, union officials, and city bureaucrats. He understood that organized crime was not just about muscle, it was about leverage.
Tommy arranged discreet contributions to city council campaigns. He ensured that union contracts favored family-controlled businesses. He mediated disputes quietly, preventing labor strikes that could disrupt Bruno family operations. To outsiders, he was a problem solver. To the family, he was a link to institutional power. But every political connection also carried risk. Law enforcement agencies, already wary of Angelo Bruno's influence, began monitoring Tommy's activities. Federal agents were particularly attentive to his interactions with unions, suspecting laundering and kickback schemes. His visibility in political circles, once a strength, was now a liability. Inside the family, Bruno watched carefully. The Don understood that the Mafia's stability depended on the illusion of control. A subordinate who could negotiate with politicians, influence unions, and organize crews without direct oversight was both invaluable and threatening. Tommy's growing autonomy was eroding the balance of power. The tipping point occurred during a confidential meeting with a local councilman. Tommy had secured approval for a new waterfront project, ensuring contracts remained favorable to the family. Soldiers and associates praised his skill. Bruno, however, saw the danger. Tommy had just bypassed several layers of the family hierarchy, executing political maneuvers that only the boss had the authority to sanction. Bruno's paranoia deepened. He feared Tommy's strategic mind could be used against him, either by rivals or by federal prosecutors leveraging Tommy's connections. The very political acumen that elevated Tommy made him a threat to the boss's dominance. At the intersection of politics and crime, loyalty became fragile. Allies whispered, enforcers hesitated. The message was clear. In the Mafia, influence beyond the immediate hierarchy is a perilous game, and for Tommy DiCarlo, that game had already begun. The stage was set. A man who had mastered control over men and institutions now stood on the precipice of isolation. The delicate balance of power in the Bruno family was tipping, and soon that imbalance would demand blood. By late 1979, Tommy DiCarlo's rise had reached a dangerous peak. His crews remained loyal, his political connections deepened, and his influence in Philadelphia's underworld was undeniable. Yet in the shadows of that success, isolation had begun to take hold. Bruno's inner circle, once trusting, now watched Tommy with wary eyes. Capos who had deferred to his judgment subtly questioned his decisions. Soldiers hesitated to act without explicit orders. Even allies who had long relied on his guidance began distancing themselves, quietly whispering concerns about Tommy's ambition. In the Mafia, perception is as lethal as bullets.
Tommy himself sensed the shift. Meetings that had once flowed smoothly now carried tension. Conversations were measured, polite, but cold. Invitations to strategy sessions became selective. His once loyal men started receiving orders from Bruno's trusted confidants, bypassing him entirely. The message was unmistakable. His influence, no matter how vital, was being curtailed. Federal scrutiny added another layer of pressure. Investigators were probing his union dealings and gambling operations. Tommy's prominence made him a prime target for subpoenas and surveillance. Allies feared that associating too closely could expose them to prosecution. Loyalty, once absolute, now wavered under the weight of fear. Bruno's strategy was surgical. Isolation is often the first step to elimination in organized crime. By slowly eroding Tommy's network of support, the boss ensured that when the moment of execution came, there would be few to resist or mourn. Capos were reminded of hierarchy through subtle threats. Soldiers observed consequences of minor insubordination. Every interaction reinforced the implicit rule, no one is untouchable and ambition can be fatal. Tommy's psychological state mirrored the environment. A man once confident in his command now navigated a labyrinth of suspicion. He understood the unspoken calculus. In the Mafia, rising too high can provoke the ultimate test of loyalty. The duality of his position, admired yet feared, indispensable yet isolated, had become unbearable. As the calendar turned to 1980, the tension reached its apex. The trap was ready, and all pieces were in motion. Tommy DiCarlo's fate was no longer determined by skill, loyalty, or political acumen. It would be decided by the silent calculus of power, by the man who had once called him indispensable. March 21, 1980 arrived with an almost cinematic calm. The streets of South Philadelphia were slick with rain, the neon signs casting fractured reflections onto puddles. Tommy DiCarlo, unaware of how closely the net had closed around him, attended what he thought was a routine meeting. Inside a modest apartment on the 1800 block of South 9th Street, a few of his closest associates waited. They greeted him warmly, a semblance of normalcy masking the tension thick in the air. Tommy, always precise, noted nothing amiss. His mind was on operations, logistics, collections, and the crew's next moves. Then came the call he had been conditioned to obey, an order from Bruno himself. One of the men present, a soldier who had served under him for years, relayed the instructions quietly. Bruno had decided Tommy's influence was now a threat that could not be contained. In the Mafia, loyalty is meaningless if it challenges authority. Witnesses later described the scene as eerily calm. No shouting, no struggle. The efficiency of the execution mirrored Tommy's own methods. He was led from the apartment, a silent escort guiding him into a waiting vehicle. Streets that had once felt like familiar territory became corridors of inevitability.
Within an hour, Tommy DiCarlo disappeared. No body was found. No crime scene lingered. The operation was clean, surgical, leaving only whispers among crews and fear in the eyes of those who remained. The message was unmistakable. Even the most loyal, most competent, most indispensable subordinate could be removed without hesitation. The fallout was immediate. Soldiers and capos adjusted rapidly, realigning loyalty and reporting structures.
Union contacts and political allies, now aware of the precarious nature of Mafia allegiances, treaded carefully. Bruno's dominance remained intact, but the family had witnessed firsthand the lethal cost of visibility and influence. For Tommy, death was both a literal and symbolic erasure. His expertise, ambition, and loyalty were all rendered irrelevant by the silent imperative of power. The very skills that had elevated him, organization, influence, foresight, became the instruments of his undoing. In Philadelphia, the disappearance sent ripples. It was a reminder that the Mafia is a hierarchy dictated not by competence or loyalty alone, but by the unyielding will of the man at the top. And when that will deems you a threat, there is no negotiation, no appeal, no escape. Tommy DiCarlo's disappearance sent immediate shockwaves through the Bruno family. Soldiers who had once admired him now moved cautiously, recalibrating alliances. Capos assumed more control over his former crews, but the vacuum left behind created tension. A man of Tommy's competence could not be replaced easily, and the ripple effects were felt in every corner of the family's operations. Philadelphia's streets whispered of the execution, even if few knew the details. Union officials, once confident in their dealings with Tommy, began hedging their bets. Politicians who had quietly accepted contributions paused, wary of the shifting dynamics. The delicate dance between organized crime and civic authority was suddenly more precarious. Within the family, Bruno's message was unmistakable. No one, not even a trusted enforcer, was beyond reproach. Soldiers learned quickly that ambition, visibility, or exceptional skill could provoke the boss's lethal intervention. Fear, not admiration, now guided loyalty. Federal investigators sensed opportunity. Tommy's disappearance, combined with his well-documented union dealings and gambling operations, became the subject of ongoing surveillance. While the authorities could not immediately connect Bruno directly to the vanishing, the case reinforced the perception of organized crime's reach and ruthlessness. Even internally, the psychological toll was profound. Men who had worked closely with Tommy wrestled with guilt, fear, and the knowledge that silence was survival. Conversations were cautious, trust fractured. For the first time, the family understood that the machinery of power can devour its own architects. Yet life within the Bruno family continued. Operations proceeded, revenues flowed, and the boss's authority remained unchallenged. The hierarchy endured, but the invisible ledger of power had shifted. Tommy DiCarlo's execution was more than a removal. It was a lesson in obedience, a stark reminder that in the Mafia, influence is tolerated only within limits dictated from above.
The city continued its rhythms, unaware of the subtle recalibrations within its underworld. And in the shadows, the echo of a man who had risen too far, too fast, lingered, a silent testament to the precarious balance between ambition and survival. March 21, 1980, remained etched in South Philadelphia's memory, not for the rain, not for the neon reflections on wet streets, but for the disappearance of a man who had once seemed untouchable. Tommy DiCarlo's story is not simply one of ambition or betrayal. It is a study of power, loyalty, and the fragile architecture of organized crime. In the Mafia, skill and loyalty are double-edged. Tommy's brilliance, his ability to manage crews, influence unions, and negotiate with authority, elevated him, but it also rendered him a threat. The hierarchy that nurtures talent is the same hierarchy that extinguishes it when perceived danger arises. Bruno's choice was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was the calculus of survival. In that world, perception is as lethal as a gun, and influence can be more dangerous than violence. There is a paradox in Tommy's trajectory. A man whose life revolved around control, precision, and foresight could not foresee the threat he posed to the very structure he served. In this sense, the story is circular. The skills that allow ascent in the underworld, strategic thinking, loyalty, discretion, are also the conditions under which one becomes expendable. The Mafia rewards obedience, but it punishes the perception of autonomy with merciless efficiency. Psychologically, Tommy's disappearance underscores the tension between public persona and private reality. Soldiers, associates, and the wider city knew him as competent, loyal, indispensable. Privately, he was isolated, watched, and ultimately sacrificed. This contrast illuminates a broader truth about power. Visibility invites scrutiny, and influence invites fear. Beyond the personal tragedy lies a reflection on human nature and society. Organized crime is a mirror to broader systems of authority.
The same principles, ambition, control, loyalty, fear, permeate politics, business, and hierarchies everywhere. Tommy DiCarlo's story reminds us that the pursuit of power is inseparable from vulnerability, and that success in any structured system carries inherent risk. Finally, the streets of South Philadelphia return to their rhythm, but the echo of that day persists. A man who managed crews for Angelo Bruno, who rose through skill, loyalty, and intelligence, was erased because the measure of his worth became his potential threat. And in the quiet aftermath, we are left to ponder. In any world governed by power, are the capable always at risk? Is loyalty ever enough to survive? Tommy DiCarlo's disappearance closes the circle, returning us to that rainy street, to the silent Cadillac, and to the immutable truth of the underworld. In the Mafia, survival is never guaranteed, and brilliance can be the deadliest vulnerability of all.